welcome to a new session of our 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference. My name is Paula and I will be the chair for this session. As you may know, today we've got a panel on the African American body. Before we start, I would like to thank our participants for their insightful proposals, which I believe come in a time when this topic feels especially relevant. We are delighted to open a conversation on this matter and to have the opportunity to get to know your fascinating work. So thank you for being here today. Of course, thanks are also due to our attendees for joining us in this session. Before I introduce our panelists, please allow me to remind our public that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you're not comfortable showing your face, please refrain from connecting your camera. Also, all microphones and cameras should be kept in the mute mode during the speakers' presentations. We will leave the Q&A for the end so that you have a chance to ask the three presenters at once. I will remind this later on, but to do so, please use the raise hand tool before connecting your microphone. Of course, you can also use the chat if you prefer that option. That said, please allow me to introduce our first speaker today, Katerina Psilopoulou, who is a PhD candidate in American literature at the University of Cambridge. She is currently working on depictions of mass incarceration in American fiction and is interested in the role of the Gothic in shaping contemporary literature. Today, Katerina will present a talk entitled Southern Gothic and the Grotesque Body in the works of Jesmyn Ward. So without further ado, Katerina, the floor is all yours.
Hi, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers for putting together such a unique and fun conference and panel. My presentation forms a small part of my MPhil thesis, which broadly dealt with the reimagining of Southern Gothic in the works of Jesmyn Ward. But today I will be specifically discussing the use of the grotesque body in her sophomore novel, Salvage the Bones. Jesmyn Ward is a Mississippi-born writer and the first woman to have won the National Book Award for Fiction twice. Her novels explore the contemporary South and the ways in which it is still haunted by its history, in the vein of William Faulkner, whom she considers a predecessor and direct influence. Partly inspired by Faulkner, her novels are all set in the fictional town of Bois Sauvage, modeled after her own hometown of Delisle, Mississippi. Unlike her predecessors, however, Ward focuses on Black Southern families and the intergenerational traumas they carry to the present, often framed through the tropes of the Southern Gothic. Before moving on to a more specific discussion of the grotesque, a quick overview of Salvage the Bones is needed to better understand how Ward blends the contemporary with the traditional. The novel follows 15-year-old Esh, who is grappling with the implications of her unplanned pregnancy in the days leading up to Hurricane Katrina. In a family dynamic reminiscent of Azalea dying, Ash is motherless and the only girl amongst her father and the three brothers, who are unaware of her pregnancy and the anguish it is causing her. Hurricane Katrina looms in the background, a character in its own right, giving the story an oppressive and urgent feel, which matches Ash's psyche. Much has been said about the depiction of the hurricane in the novel, which Ward experienced firsthand, and the devastating effects it had on Black Southern communities. However, Ward's role as a vanguard for a new tradition of Southern Gothic and the way she's reimagining the genre have been left largely unexplored. My aim is to examine one aspect of this revisionist project and how Ward uses the trope of the grotesque body in her novel, both literally through Ash's pregnancy and metaphorically through the force of the impending storm. The grotesque is a slippery term and has had a fraught relationship with the Southern Gothic. Flannery O'Connor famously decried that, quote, anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, in which case it's going to be called realistic, end quote. Alan Spiegel claimed that the term has been, quote, applied so frequently and so recklessly that it had become increasingly difficult to use it with any degree of clarity or precision, end quote. Truly, the grotesque has been invoked to refer to a mood, a style, or a situation, but the definition that interests me is the one pertaining to the body. In 1972, Spiegel offered one of the first concise definitions of the grotesque, as a character type who is always, quote, a physically or mentally deformed figure, end quote. For Spiegel, what makes characters such as Benji in The Sound and the Fury grotesque is their transcendence of their disability, to the point where the reader can evince pity and compassion for them and their plight. As such, the grotesque figure is a character who is, quote, a thorn in the side of the society which produced him. His existence tells the society something about itself, whether it wishes to acknowledge his existence or not. He informs society that his deformity is real, that it is there, and will continue to be there because it is society's deformity which produced it as well as his own, end quote. Spiegel's emphasis on the body is not without precedent. Mikhail Bakhtin had linked the grotesque with a body of, quote, unashamed excess, anathema to authority and pious austerity, end quote, a body that interacts intimately with the world and challenges its limits and hierarchies. Patricia Jaeger has argued that while grotesque bodies are not strictly a Southern phenomenon, they provide a particularly condensed and useful figure of thought for presenting a set of problems plaguing the South, such as oppressive ideals of womanhood and the pervasive memory of racial violence and slavery. In Ward's work, the grotesque is often represented by a physical state that is deemed or interpreted as grotesque, such as an unplanned teenage pregnancy or drug addiction, problems that indeed plague the South, but which are also figured racially. That is, they are displaced onto poor Black communities and deemed problems specific to them as a race and class, rather than a widespread social phenomenon. However, Ward destabilizes this association by also expanding on the notion that the true grotesque is found in the social conditions that disenfranchise African American Southerners and other minority communities. In her use of the grotesque personified in Esch's pregnancy, Ward challenges its traditional and problematic equation of physical or mental disability with either moral corruption or childlike innocence. Her characters are not in the vein of Faulkner's innocent Benji or O'Connor's nihilistic Hazel Motes. Instead, work works within the framework of what Jasper Poor has termed debility, that is, bodily injury and social exclusion brought on by economic and political factors, which is, quote, endemic, perhaps even normative to disenfranchised communities, a banal feature of quotidian existence that is already definitive of the precarity of that existence, end quote. Debility implies a larger scheme of injustices that marginalize and oppress certain groups and communities, manifesting tangibly in lower quality infrastructure and schooling, no access to healthcare, fewer job opportunities, poverty, drug abuse, and even premature death on the individual level. Thus, debility within a community is a form of intergenerational trauma, whose effects white writers deem grotesque. Ward's characters are victims of such a system, and the seemingly grotesque aspects of their bodies or their situations are not indicators of their moral value, but rather the product of an environment of sustained violence. In this environment, a teenage pregnancy is not only deemed grotesque and immoral, but can be a life-threatening situation for mother and child. Because her characters exist in a climate of debility, Ward depicts the bodily processes of pregnancy and birth viscerally and at times grotesquely, illustrating her understanding of the South as, quote, a place where Black people were bred and understood to be animals, end quote. Christopher Lloyd observes that Ward is, quote, interested in the ways bodies are never quite intact or entire or solid. Black Southerners are complexly presented as precarious, creaturely, and throwaway, end quote. In fact, animal imagery runs parallel to Esch's pregnancy, exemplifying how her condition is viewed by herself and by outsiders. Salvage the Bones opens with the family's pit bull, China, giving birth to a litter of puppies. The physicality of the birth is rendered in stark realism, with China, quote, turning on herself, snarling, her sides rippling, and then she seems to be turning herself inside out and splits as she delivers, end quote. China's delivery is connected by a flashback to the scene in which Ash's mother gives birth to her final child, Junior. The family's lack of resources and no access to healthcare only allows for a dangerous home birth, in which the women are reduced to an animalistic state, no better than a pit bull. After a difficult home delivery, Ash's mother, quote, shook her head, raised her head to the ceiling like an animal on the slaughter stump, end quote. She does not speak to Ash, but she looks at her for the last time, and Ash imagines her mother saying to her, quote, don't do it, don't become the woman in this bed, Ash, end quote. In other words, motherhood is deeply inscribed in Ash's mind as a life-threatening situation, one to be avoided at all costs. Witnessing her mother's death in childbirth, as well as the puppy's graphic birth, Ash irrevocably comes to view pregnancy and motherhood as animalistic and grotesque states. Such thinking is also influenced by internalized racism, with Ash fearing that she is the confirmation of white society's worst stereotypes about Black girls and Black motherhood more specifically. These thoughts further isolate Ash, and she comes to view the child she's carrying as something alien and hostile to her bodily autonomy. Upon first discovering that she's pregnant, she thinks, quote, the terrible truth of what I am flares like a dry fall fire in my stomach. There is something in there, end quote. Later, when she vomits, the child is described as a mysterious thing clinging to her insides. Quote, I cannot stop heaving up air and spit, but still, I'm not able to throw it all up. Inside, at the bottom, something remains, end quote. The fetus is figured as an unknown parasite, and Ash's womb almost like a haunted house, terrorized by an unseen ghost. The situation recalls Morrison's Beloved, where the ghost of the titular child returns to haunt her mother, Seath. Like Seath, Ash struggles to maintain a separate sense of self as the child takes over. The fear of birthing a monster, a common Gothic trope, is present in Ash's feelings about her pregnancy. Monsters often represent unwanted, aggressive, or sexual thoughts, and thus embody what humans fear is evil and destructive in themselves. They're also like caricatures, larger than life, and by seeing them this way, argues Barbara Almond, we can deny their connection to our own impulses and feelings. Until Ash accepts and embraces the baby she's carrying as her own, then her body will continue to feel alien and grotesque to her, stigmatized by society. If she does not, the only other recourse is violence, in the vein of ancient Greek tragedy. In fact, Greek myth features prominently throughout the story. Since Ash lacks a female figure to guide her through these troubling times, she turns to Greek mythology and its heroines. Like other African-American writers such as Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison, Ward is drawn to the classics, although she complains that many readers and critics still assume that, quote, the work of white American writers can be universal and lay claim to classic texts, while Black and female authors are ghettoized as other, end quote. She therefore wanted to align Ash with that classic text, to claim that tradition as part of her own Western literary heritage, end quote. Moreover, the Gothic is intimately related to Greek myth with its tales of murder, disfigurement, incest, madness, and unspeakable violence. The key figure for Ward, as for Morrison, is Medea, notorious for murdering her children and becoming the quintessential symbol of monstrous or grotesque motherhood. But she's also the archetypal other, a witch and a barbarian and non-Greek in the eyes of the society. She's an example of how the oppressed victim will strike against their oppressor. She also has much in common with the Gothic anti-hero, whose nefarious deeds and their justifications for them make them far more interesting than the typical pious heroines of Gothic romances. Hurricane Katrina, dubbed by the media the monster of the Atlantic, is the most obvious vehicle for Medea. As Ward has said, quote, Medea is in Hurricane Katrina because Medea's power to unmake worlds, to manipulate the elements, closely aligns with the storm, end quote. In the storm's aftermath, grotesque images of bloated bodies circulated in the media, bodies which Katrina had exhumed in a perverse kind of rebirth. What was brought to the surface, however, were not only bodies, but racial and class fault lines that mark an increasingly damaged and withering democracy in which entire populations are considered disposable. Medea is also found in the pit bull, China, who in an act of graphic violence kills one of her puppies, snapping her jaw around its neck and chewing. Ash, witnessing that event, thinks to herself, quote, is this what motherhood is, end quote. It seems possible that Ash will follow in Medea's footsteps or repeat her mother's tragic fate. But Ward's narrative decidedly breaks away from that pattern of trauma and allows its characters a chance to reemerge after the storm and rebuild. The decisive moment comes during the storm, when Ash and her family, devoid of any resources, ignore the call to evacuate and brace for the hurricane's impact. At risk of losing her life and her child, Ash begins to think of it not as a parasite or a monster, but, quote, as a budding baby, end quote. When her father discovers the pregnancy amidst the chaos, he's not cross or disgusted. Instead, he's gentle and understanding, another reversal of tropes and expectations, for he had previously been presented as an indifferent drunkard, the common assumption for single Black fathers living in poverty. After the storm, when asked by Big Henry, one of the neighborhood boys, who the father is, Ash replies, quote, it don't have a daddy, end quote. Henry, though, answers, quote, you're wrong. This baby got plenty of daddies, end quote. Ash is not a single mother in the traditional sense, as she is supported by a community similar to that found in Beloved. In Morrison's novel, that community comes together, and their united song finally banishes Beloved's spirit. In Salvage the Bones, after the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina, the community's joint efforts not only rebuild what was lost, but also foster new life out of the debris. Ash is no longer isolated as seen as other because of her condition, but part of a larger collective of which her child belongs to as well. Motherhood is no longer seen as a life-threatening animalistic condition, but a joyous event and an affirmation of life, despite what the outside community might think of Ash and women like her. Thus, Escha's story moves from destruction to regeneration, and her body, which was once deemed as grotesque, is now the source of life. To summarize, Ward employs the Gothic mode to reveal the already precarious reality of Black life in the South and expose the ways in which reality is more horrifying than fiction. Her characters are indeed thorns in the society which produced them, but she insists they're also complex humans, not types or caricatures. Her work demands that the reader not look away from their plight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. This has been such an interesting analysis of the novel, and I am sure many of our attendees will have plenty of questions to ask. As you know, we will leave these questions for the end and move directly to our next talk by Alejandro Batista Tejada from the University of Seville. Alejandro is currently working on transethnicity and the literature of the Spanish Civil War. His interests are African American literature, metafiction and film studies, and lately Gothic and horror fiction too. Today, he will present a talk entitled Ethnic Negotiations in Lovecraft Country, using the Gothic to discuss systemic racism in the US. So, Alejandro, whenever you feel ready.
Okay, I'm ready. Hello, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you to the board for organizing such a enlightening and such an interesting conference. And well, and congratulations for the work you have done, because it's been a very fun ride, and I'm learning quite a lot with all the panels and the keynote speakers. So congratulations for that. And yes, well, let me share my screen first. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, it is entitled Ethnic Negotiations. We are going to look at the negotiations that we can appreciate in this series between the two main races that are portrayed in the series. And we are going to look at how the series uses the Gothic to discuss this systemic racism in the US. So first of all, I wanted to let you see the structure, because first we are going to establish the relationship between H.P. Lovecraft and Lovecraft Country, the series, and see how the series reverses and references the work of the master of the cosmic horror. Then we are going to look at the Gothic, how the Gothic is employed in the series. Then we are going to have a look at the real horror that is, for me, the real horror in Lovecraft Country. You may think, okay, the horror is the Gothic, right? But I think that the series makes a point in pointing out the real horror in the country, in America, in that specific time. Then we're going to look at these ethnic negotiations and how magic is a determining factor in these negotiations. Well, finally, I want to provide a conclusion, a kind of summary of what the series intends to do with the Gothic and how it portrays racism and these horror historical events. Okay, so okay. So first, let's have a look at Lovecraft, which gives his name to the title of the series. And well, his magnificent career, has been lately, in the last decade or so, stained, so to speak, because of his explicit racism, and because more and more scholars have wanted to point out those racist attitudes and how he portrays uh, people of other races, and how he enacts his xenophobic attitudes. So first, I wanted to include a quote, a quotation by Houellebecq. He says, quote, when I read his descriptions of nightmarish creatures I would have never supposed that they had their origin in real human beings. End quote. This is his emphasis. So, as I have told you, Lovecraft was a xenophobic, anthropocentric, and racist person, and this had its echo on his text. Some of his most horrible creatures originate from a gross miscegenation of races and species. Sometimes it is a crossbreeding between sea creatures and humans. In other instances, they are of extraterrestrial origin. But the truth that underlies these instances in Lovecraft's fear of modernization is his fear of losing what was traditional and established. And continue with this idea, I quote, his fiction grew out of his horror at the disintegration of American culture in the face of moral, racial, and scientific chaos. So this idea is similar to the previous one, and it states that culture was for him, American culture was all about white supremacy and the purist New England landscape. Anything that could disturb that state of affairs was detrimental to America and its people, that is, white people, of course. But of course, as I told you previously, many scholars have defended his literature. Every time that someone tries to point out his racism, there are some defenders who try to, you know, to clean his name and to praise him for his literature, not for his connotations. And here we have an instance for this. It is from Yoshi, one of his most prominent scholars, who says, quote, "It is not to the point that we should call Lovecraft wrong about his attitudes," end quote, "since, quote, there is no recorded instance of any action of his part against minorities," end of quote. But well, dear Lovecraftian scholars, let me tell you that someone who writes ethnocentric texts which show racist attitudes is indeed someone who acts against minorities. Then, what the series does is to reverse Lovecraft and these racist and xenophobic notions. So Misha Green's the main writer and creator of Lovecraft Countries, says that, quote, "What I was hoping to achieve was this with this show was for people to start a conversation," end of quote. So Misha Green's series is therefore a rejection of those justifications and, what's more, an endeavor to reference Lovecraft's universe in order to reverse it. While Lovecraft's body of work perpetuates some attitudes and thoughts that were typical of his time, Lovecraft Country builds on those very racist foundations in order to mock and overturn them in the series. As Aya Romano accurately puts it, uh, Lovecraft Country's approach to Lovecraft's legacy is simultaneously one of shrewd affection and resigned repulsion. So it is both a kind of homage to Lovecraft literature, but it's also a criticism of his very literature. So, as you can see, the series references the Lovecraftian universe in order to reverse its foundations. So, now going to the Gothic in Lovecraft Country, I wanted to first introduce a definition by the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, which states that we can extract that the Gothic takes place in an antiquated or seemingly antiquated space. End of quote. So in the series, this Gothic space is Jim Crow America, and the series thrives in order to portray this. So, and in the title, we can see that it can unfold a twofold interpretation. First, we see that sorry, can we stop for a minute? Oof. I'm running out of breath and I'm really nervous. So, okay. So I I continue. So the title then is both a geographical metaphor referring to New England and the kind of cities that Lovecraft depicted in his stories, and also a metaphor of the racist nature of the country in which the story is set. It is a country of people who abhor and who are disgusted by colored people. It is a country of people who, like H.P. Lovecraft, systemically despise and marginalize people of color or people of other races. So, in the next quote, we see that, quote, Gothic fictions generally play with and oscillate between the earthly laws of conventional reality and the possibilities of the supernatural. So the boundaries between these, reality, the conventional reality, and the supernatural, the boundaries between these may be crossed psychologically, physically, or both. In this sense, we have a fictional show with fictional aspects that bleed into reality and whose boundaries are often crossed. And to further with this idea, to further explain this idea, I want to show you this quote that says, quote, the central concerns of the classical Gothic are not that different from those of the contemporary Gothic. The dynamics of family, the limits of rationality and passion, the definition of statehood and citizenship, the cultural effects of technology. We see all these aspects of Gothic, contemporary or classical, in the series, in Lovecraft Country. So, some aspects of Lovecraft Country that are intrinsically Gothic are, for example, the haunted house, the Winthrop house. We have, of course, ghosts and presences from the afterlife. Of course, tons of blood, which are very gore and Gothic. And of course, again, Lovecraftian creatures. The best example is the Shoggoth. But going back to the haunted house, I wanted to point out the fact that this house is haunted by a white man who carried out experiments on black people and who wants these black residents out of the house. But if we analyze this in broader terms, this house is also a reflection of America as a whole, with its white owners, figuratively, fighting to preserve their predominance over the rest of the ethnic groups. Another symbolical event takes place when they are trying to cast out the ghost of this white man. So the only way that they find to cast this ghost out of the house is to gather strength as a community. This is actually the first statement in the series that the feat on white supremacy is only attainable by fighting together as a community. And then a healing process begins when we see that the transfigured bodies are slowly recovering their original form after having cast out this presence. So regarding ghosts and presences from the afterlife, I wanted also to point out that there's also a color line here in this aspect too, because in the case of white ghost, they are commonly evil forces in the series. But when the afterlife presences are of color people, they appear in order to pass on a birthright tradition. They want to give some answers, to give some help in the crusade against this magical white supremacy. So moving on. Well, no, not moving on. Let's have a look at the Shoggoths because Misha Green actually in a kind of docu teaser about crafting Lovecraft Country, she states that they knew, quote, that they wanted to pay homage to H.P. Lovecraft's Shoggoths, and we're going to see why. Because in Lovecraft's mythology, the Shoggoths are a race created by the Elder Things. Again, if we draw the analogy, the Elder Things, white people in America, that's the relationship. So the cities of the Elder Things were built upon the labor of the Shoggoths, also an analogy with uh, black people in America. But, and this is the key to understand the presence of the Shoggoths and their importance in the series, is that the Shoggoths eventually rebel against their oppressors. And this is a parallelism with the series, as the group of protagonists eventually rebel and defeat their white counterparts through magic. So moving on. Now, the real horror in Lovecraft Country, fiction against reality. I want to first analyze the difference or the parallel again between the implicit and the explicit, because uh, in Lovecraft, for example, racism is commonly implicit. It's something that seeps into the narrative and into the the definition of some creatures or of some people even, and it is explicit only in some instances. So in the series, it happened something similar happens in this regard, because you know racism is something that is there, that is constantly a presence there, but it's only in few occasions that it's brutally and horribly explicit. And this leads us to the next point, which is a history of racism, because the series uses historical real events of of racist aggressions from white people towards black people in the United States. Uh, so it is indeed underlying in the different negotiations that we will see in the next section, racism, I mean, but racism is frequently made explicit through these historical reenactments. For example, the Tulsa massacre that we see in episode 9, which is very dramatic and it's very extremely moving, and the murder of Emmett Till, the experimentation of black bodies that we see in the Winthrop House, which resembles the Tuskegee syphilis study, which experimented on male black bodies. So yes, as we have been seeing, however outrageous an aspect of Lovecraft Country's fictionalized racism may seem, there is almost always a comparable real event from US history, which is many times worse than the fictional recreation. And as Jarnee Smollett, the girl who plays Letitia Lewis, says, our nation has been built upon systemic racism. Racism is a demonic spirit, and that's what we are exploring in our show. And as I said, the show does this excellently. So now, going to the ethnic negotiations, I appreciated that these negotiations go in a gradual crescendo. I mean that they go from powerlessness in the black, from the black part, towards an actual negotiation, because in the first instances we see that they are powerless against Sheriff Hunt or against Samuel Braithwaite. Then we see leverage when they have to kind of negotiate with Samuel, and who has Atticus' father. And finally, negotiation comes with Christina Braithwaite. Okay, so sorry again. Okay, so negotiation comes with Christina Braithwaite because she attempts to collaborate with Black people in as much as they can help her attain immortality to prove the world that women, that is white women, can also take part in political and social power. So there are many examples of negotiation between Christina and Atticus. For example, when they are in the lodge, and she says, "I can take you to your father," end quote. And Atticus replies that, well, ask her to remove the spell on Letty and his uncle. But then Christina accedes to do that, but as a consequence, traps them in the rooms. So as we see, white people always have the upper hand in the negotiations until the very end of the series. So the ultimate and the most signifying negotiation between Christina and our characters of color take place in the season finale, when she demands the superior source of magic, the Book of Names. Okay, so when she demands that they give her the book, she claims that, quote, "this isn't generational hate. Our families are not at war." Families, we can drag again the analogy between families and races. "This has never been personal," end of quotes. And then Monroe replies, "You're trying to kill my son." And Christina, quite, mm, quite interestingly, says, "His death is a consequence of a spell I'm attempting to cast. There's no other way for it to work with the tools at my disposal." So, as we see, his death is a consequence of the system society is based on. In other words, white supremacy is a consequence of how the country was established. An oppression on Black people is just a consequence with no way around it. Okay, so these lines themselves point out to oblivious white and class privilege and the sense of entitlement it often entails. So she continues and says, quote, "Give it to me and you have my word. I will leave you and your family alone." But of course, there is no other way to achieve or to perpetuate her goal without his blood. That is, there is no other way of maintaining white supremacy without systematic racism and without free use of Black bodies and lives in order to keep it that way. And as we go to the final conclusion, so I wanted to point out the ending because the ending is great, is fantastic. So the ending is, in my opinion, an ultimate mockery on Lovecraft's racism, because the final scene is the series ultimate, you know, mockery reversal of the author's racist, misogynistic, all-male literature. It includes one of its famous creations, the Shoggoth, a white woman defeated by the race he so abhorred, and a young Black woman with a robot arm. And the robot arm is signifying and symbolical of advancement, new generations, all that was, horrible to Lovecraft because he was against advancement and modernization. So this is doubly ironical. So this ending is, if not happy, fitting and earned. Uh, Another point is that another point made in this ending is that change only takes place when there is a tragic event that moves a certain collective. So the sacrifice of Atticus in a Christ-like pose heralds the salvation of a race. As it is commonly the case, change only takes place after a human sacrifice. And Another point I wanted to include in my conclusion is that however dreadful the Gothic elements may seem in the series, there is always some real racist counterpart which is exponentially more dreadful than the gore and Gothic features of the series. And finally, so in the world of the series, magic and wizardry are real things that dictate the social and political hierarchy, capable of doing everything from creating hallucinations and erasing memories to erecting invisible barriers. But again, this is symbolical of America, real American, with regards to African American people. Magic and wizardry are the state of things in America, with white race as the privileged figure imposing its supremacy on the other races. Hallucinations are the news and propaganda which change people's perceptions and mindsets in order to further establishing the status quo. The erasing of memories clearly alludes to collective memory, which has a quiet, brief span of focus and interest, which disappears gradually towards oblivion, as is the case with, for example, the Tulsa massacre. And then finally, invisible barriers are symbolical of the actual barriers that have historically separated African Americans from white people through segregation or through the invisible barriers that make it harder for Black people to access important posts or to have equal treatment by legal institutions and law enforcement units. So these are the works I cited. And well, thank you very much for your attention. I included this quotation from the series, which is fantastic. That is signifying of the African American community that he who has felt the deepest grief is best able to experience supreme happiness. So then again, thank you for your attention. Sorry for the problems we came across, and I stopped sharing. So thank you.
Well, that was a very interesting take on the series, Alejandro, so thank you for that. Again, before the questions, let's move on to our final talk today by Elena Apostolaki, who is a PhD candidate at the Artes Graduate School for the Humanities Cologne, University of Cologne, Germany. Her main research interests include American popular culture, media representation and cultural production, with a focus on outlaws and or marginalized social groups, socio-political concepts and ideologies. Elena is currently working as a tutor at the Department of English Language and Literature of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, Greece, while conducting the workshop American History and Culture. Today, she will talk about race, metamorphosis, and body horror in HBO's Lovecraft Country. So, Elena, whenever you feel ready.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also congratulations to everyone who was involved in this great series that we're actually participating in. And also congratulations to the previous two speakers. Great job, guys. That was really interesting listening to your own perspective analysis and your own main research fields. Let me share my screen. Let me do the thing we did before. Let me see if that works. Hopefully it will work. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. So today my topic today is going to focus again on Lovecraft Country, particularly in one episode. It's going to consist of a short analysis of how the metamorphosis of body horror has been incorporated in this particular episode. So before we begin, I don't know why it doesn't. Can you see the second slide? Because I think there is some kind of no.
No, I don't think so.
Let me try again. Okay, now it works. So I'm gonna give you like a short introduction on the TV series. So Lovecraft Country is based actually on a novel, and it focuses on the horrifying world of H.P. Lovecraft and also the very real world of Jim Crow America during the 1950s. The series is developed by Misha Green and produced by Jordan Peele and places the Black protagonist in the center of a Lovecraftian horror story. The show, of course, comments upon real racism, but also includes another great and fresh focus on the genre of the subgenre of body horror, and gives us another take on whiteness and privilege and gender division. So one of the most horrifying like subgenres of horror subgenres is, of course, body horror. The past year and also this year is filled with fears of the unknown, particularly in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. The subgenre has become increasingly popular the past year and also during this year, based again on the fear of what will become of humanity as a result of this pandemic, especially in regard to the biological structure of human beings. Ultimately, body horror productions have become popular because they take the fears that permeate society and make them real. So in a way, they force audiences to recognize the increasingly complicated relationships human beings have with their surroundings by using shock value and, of course, bodily horrors. Body horror plays on humans' deepest fears of having our own bodies violated by other sinister entities. Gruesome experimentations, zombification, possession, and any other ideas that include like anything creepy and crawly under our skin is enough to make almost everyone uncomfortable. As Mara Bucham argues, quote, body horror sometimes gets a bad reputation because it is known for being gory, whether it's through approaching phobias by tapping into exploitation movie tropes, or psychologically disturbing depiction of human body, sexuality, gender, disease, or sex acts, end quote. From Mary Shelby's novel Frankenstein to Cronenberg's movies like The Fly and Dead Riggers, and to Carpenter's The Thing, body horror has been used to explore a human body as a site of a metamorphosis. And usually this metamorphosis and the process of metamorphosis incorporates graphic, monstrous, and really grotesque aesthetics. Now, going back to the actual, moving on actually to the actual episode from Lovecraft Country. In this episode is the 5th episode actually of the show. It's entitled A Strange Case, which is, I really love this title because it directly draws connection to the strange case of Jekyll and Hyde. I'm going to refer that later, but I really like that this kind of short title actually draws connection to the novel. So in this episode, we actually see Ruby Batista, who is the sister of Leticia, one of the main protagonists, subjected to a potion and wakes up as a white woman. She soon discovers how life easier is under this white skin and under her alter ego, Hilary Davenport. It's a gruesome body horror story, but allows Ruby to gain agency and use her magic potion as a freedom and liberation tool. This transformation, as I said before, allows Ruby to gain not only agency, but also the social protection whiteness offer in this case. At first, Ruby is horrified by her transformation. She wakes up in this great mansion of the Williams house to discover that she's actually in a white body instead of her own Black female body. Ruby stumbles back into her own predominantly Black neighborhood in search for help. However, she quickly discovers the social protection that whiteness offers. The police arrives and treats her with respect, with kindness, with empathy, like every human being deserves to be treated. And she's actually being escorted to her back to William's house, who poses as her ward husband. When she arrives there, we actually witness the transformation, not in actual. There's no zooming in the actual like horrific and grotesque transformation, but we just see it in the background, as you see here in the third screenshot. Her borrowed body begins to crackle and break as the spells wears off. So her skin actually crawls, and Ruby screams in panic, followed by William dragging on a rug. and plunging a carving knife on her chest, trying to, in a way, cutting out the white skin and help her get out of the white body. So later, William compares, after she wakes up, of course, in her own body, William compares Ruby's transformation to a metamorphosis, and he explains how this potion actually mimics the process of metamorphosis. He actually says that quote, a butterfly lives a full life before it dies. Then a caterpillar emerges from the same cells, the essence of the butterfly, yet different. It's more, end of quote. Later, we see him that he gives her a choice to either leave and move on and go about with her normal life, or to stay and take advantage of the potion. Ruby actually chooses the latter. And at first, she feels like a sense of freedom and liberation and joy. We see her later in the episode, actually in the disguise of Hillary, casually strolling through a predominantly white area of Chicago, eating ice cream, reading the paper, and she's really like happy with her new appearance, right? Ruby gets to go through her day without any fear of harassment or violence or racism. And at this point, what the episode does is, which is great, in my opinion, it actually addresses the idea of what it means to be uninterrupted in terms both of gender and race. So Ruby is willing to undergo this horrific and grotesque and quite painful transformation to become a white woman, so that she can walk freely without having to defend herself or dealing with racist or degrading situations. So being white for her means she can go on with her life without any interruptions. And this is also confirmed later on when Ruby admits to William that, quote, I enjoyed my entire day using the only currency I needed, whiteness. And then she adds, I don't know what is more difficult, being colored or being a woman. Most days I'm happy with both, but the world keeps interrupting me, and I'm sick of being interrupted. So we see how her own identity and her own skin and her own gender, in a way, on quotation marks, like blocking her from being her true self. Moving on, as I mentioned before, Ruby actually chooses to take the potion and disguise and as Hillary. So under her white skin, Ruby finally gets a job at the Marshall Fields department store, and she quickly named the assistant manager. This gives her an inside look into how white people interact with their own circles. However, when she interacts with the only other Black woman working at the store, everything she says reads slightly more threatening, coming from a white woman. So her insistence that Tamara actually does better feels more condescending than actually caring and encouraging. So that actually, this kind of idea that Ruby has in her head about Black people is referred to in the third episode, Holy Ghost, when Ruby says, quote, if more colored folks fought like me, the race would be a lot further along, end quote. So it seems that Ruby actually settles into her whiteness a little too well, at least, in the beginning. At the same time, she cannot shake her the Blackness at her core, right? So the way she actually talks to Tamara and the way she approaches her and tells her that she has to do better while she's being actually in her white body, and also Tamara's white superior, her tones feel more like a presumption or even a threat. Ruby doesn't want Tamara just to do her best, but to do everything in her power to meet the impossible standards of white people. So what Ruby, Ruby seems to actually buy into this philosophy of Black exceptionalism, believing that if she is educated, articulate and dignified, she can actually earn white people's respect. This kind of concept, the concept of Black exceptionalism, frames success as adjacent to whiteness. Namely, it shifts the trauma of white supremacy onto Black people who cannot like find a way out of poverty or afford to attend school in this case. So Tamara, we see that she's actually trapped in a rigged system where she now represents all Black people. So any misstep or failure on her end makes them all look bad. However, what Ruby doesn't understand in this case is that the reverse isn't true. So if Tamara succeeds in everything and presents her best self, that doesn't mean that all Black people will look good to white people, right? So white supremacy doesn't work like that. Later in the episode, let me share the slide because again, okay. So later in the episode, Ruby actually forces, in quotation marks, Samara to take the rest of her and the rest of the staff to the south side. Tamara there is treated by her white colleagues more like an animal in the zoo, and also the white women, sorry, are treating Black men as toys. So Ruby is disgusted by this behavior, so she rushes out from the bar. In this case, we see actually Ruby shedding her skin, so she becomes her true self when she's outside of the bar, and she's also becomes a witness of her manager actually making a move of Tamara and trying to assault her. However, in this state, Ruby cannot intervene because she's she's naked and covered in guts, so she cannot actually intervene and save Tamara. So she just becomes a witness of this horrific event. What this episode does, which is, I think the whole TV show does, but particularly in this episode, Strange Case, there's a clear line between. Sorry, I skipped a slide. So sorry. Again, the Strange Case draws a clear line between being a white woman and being a Black woman. And Ruby has been actually on both sides to confirm the differences right now, right? So it turns out that Christina is also using the same potion to be William. So in her way, she uses the potion to gain access to privileges and rooms and places that are denied to her due to her gender because she's a woman. Of course, Christina's lives and experiences cannot compare with Ruby's, but it speaks to their underlying desires to climb the privilege pyramid and how gender inequality actually plays a crucial role in that. So Ruby makes it clear to Christina, and I think this is a really powerful visual, and also like the lines that are used here, the dialogue is really powerful between these two women. So Ruby actually says to Christina, quote, "You can relate to who I am, and I've spent enough time on your side of color line to know that the only thing that you white women are disillusioned with is yourselves." So Ruby's dual racial identity is more than just about freedom. Ruby wants to use and to take advantage of her power to do, as Christina later says, whatever the F she wants. And Ruby knows exactly where to begin. So Ruby steps back into Hilary's skin, to her white skin, quits her job and seduces her ex-boss before actually brutally abusing him for attempting to sexually assault Tamara. In this scene, again, it's really graphic and grotesque. We see again how Ruby actually lets her flesh fall freely before facing him and let him know that a Black woman is doing this to him. What's really interesting here is that we're actually witnessing this kind of action to the sound of "This Is Bloody Shoes" from Cardi B's Bodak Yellow playing in the background, which I think is a really interesting combination of the visual that is being used with the soundtrack, which is more contemporary. In comparison to the TV show. So what's really interesting here is that we in this particular event or action of Ruby, we get to see that actually Ruby is at the same time essentially invisible, visible, and invisible. So everyone will see and respect her in her skin. However, when she's in her own black skin, she's treated in a totally different way. Either she's being she has to face like really racist, degrading situations, or she's being completely ignored by the rest of the society. So what's also really interesting in this scene is that Ruby is actually using her both of racial identities to perform this kind of like act. So she, in the beginning, she deploys her white female body to seduce a manager, and then she used her black body to hurt him. So this action can be read not only as an act of taking revenge for Tamara, but also as an outlet of a lifetime of stifle rage. So that's found really interesting in this particular scene. So along with body horror, the Metamorphosis theme can be traced back to Franz Kafka novel The Metamorphosis, or Verwandlung in German. And of course, as I mentioned before, Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which the title of the episode actually pays tribute to his work in this case, and also Jonathan Glazer's film Under the Skin, which is more recent. So this work also deal with the alien figure or the other set that comes out of this metamorphosis process, both literally and metaphorically. So in Strange Case, Ruby, who has been excluded and disfranchised by the white community, namely is the alienated person who gains agency and authority and actually has access to the world of whiteness. And the parallel that can be drawn here, particularly from Glazer's Under the Skin film, is that the alien creature that ends up using the appointed female body to access the human experience and also to gain full agency on it. This also can draw parallels to the real Jim Crow era, where Black people were actually excluded, segregated, and degraded. So they were actually being treated as aliens, as the other. So the figure of the other in this case is the non-white, so the black person, the black community that they were treating with hostility and considered to be savages or even evil, and by no means should be included in or accepted by societies, particularly of southern and border states. Kevin Gates notes that, quote, Jim Crow segregation confined the majority of African Americans to a state of economic peonage as agricultural workers, making wage-earning jobs of the New South industrial order whites only economic preserves, end of quote. So Jim Crow segregation reinforced the alienation and marginalization of Black people in workplace, education, and virtually all phases of public life in the South. So body horror in the case of, and also the metamorphosis now in the case of Lovecraft Country, Strange Case, deconstruct the established and patronizing norms of both race and racial identity. Using both the aesthetics of horror and grotesque visualization, Strange Case depicts race as a non-constant and underlines the fluidity of both race and gender, as it debunks the notion of exclusivity of both racial and gender identity. Namely, the idea that race and gender are not permanent and fixed, but rather imprecise and variable. The interpretation of someone's gender and race, including their self-identification and identification by others, can change over the course of a lifetime. So in this case, body horror is used as a tool to break the oppressive and anachronistic racial and gender dichotomy. Racial, like the dichotomy between the white versus the non-white, and the gender dichotomy of the male versus the female. And at the same time, it helps the viewers to foster a deeper understanding on the severe impact of racism, discrimination, and social exclusion of non-white groups and women. Thank you very much for the attention, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. That has been very enlightening. I have a feeling that this has been such a thought-provoking panel, and I think that all of your talks speak to one another in different ways. So maybe we can explore that a little now. As you all know, it is now time to move on to the Q&A. You may raise your hand using the tool and I will call your name. Of course, we recommend that if possible, you use your microphone and camera so that our presenters can see and hear who's actually asking the question. But if you don't feel comfortable doing so, please type your question in the chat box and I will read it out loud. So do we have any questions from the audience? I believe Monica has a question.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, all right. So thank you very much for these talks. I really enjoyed this panel. I don't have a question for anyone in particular, it's just for the three speakers. And while in your talks, you've been mentioning the Gothic tangentially, there's been like a mixture of terms like horror films, the grotesque, the Gothic, body horror. And I would like you, because this is a conference about the Gothic and all this in all these sessions that we've had, we've attempted to define the subgenre or the mode, and it's been quite difficult, and we've concluded that it blurs with other modes or genres. So I would like to ask you to develop a bit more in your talks about how the Gothic manifests in the projects that you were analyzing, in the sense that yeah, we've perceived that there's a lot of racial horror in these projects, but I was wondering about this more openly Gothic sense in terms of doubling, in terms of the uncanny, in terms of psychological horror, in terms of, well, this horror going back to psychoanalytical conceptions. Like, how is this, are these projects Gothic and not merely horror? Where do you see the Gothic in its psychic dimension, or in whatever ways you have to define the Gothic, because there's no one in the works that you've chosen to analyze?
I can give an attempt, I guess, because I work primarily with Southern Gothic, which it just becomes further muddled, I think, because when you talk about Southern Gothic, you're really talking about the racial history of the United States. There's no way to avoid that, and it's something that you can see clearly in Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor, and those things do merge with the body and body horror and the grotesque inevitably, because the racial history of the United States is so like attached to the body of the slave or Black Americans. So in that way, like, psychology does enter the picture and psychoanalysis, but it's just so intrinsically linked with the physicality of the place of both the United States and, like, more specifically the South in my case. So yes, psychoanalytically, you can talk about the past and intergenerational trauma and how that carries through to the present. And there are other works by Jasmine Ward which do present that more clearly another time, I guess. But no matter what, it's always very much connected to the physicality of the space. So in that way, I do think the Gothic cannot be really separated from the horror aspect of it in that way.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If I can add up on that, well, regarding my presentation, since it is about, you know, racism in the US and so on, I wanted to go back to the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, because it defines horror Gothic as well, as confronting the principal characters with the gross violence of physical or psychological dissolution, explicitly shattering the assumed norms of everyday life, you know, with shocking and revolting consequences. So I think that the series is all about this, confronting the characters with the everyday life, you know, horror that we can well, we can't because we are not in America, but that you can appreciate in everyday life in America, with this very contemporary racial tensions and conflicts. So I think in particular with regards to Lovecraft countries, it's all about confronting these African American characters with their space, their territory, their country, which is intrinsically racist.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I also add up to, I mean, of course, both the Katerina and Alejandro, I totally agree with what you said. And also, what I want to add here is, since, I mean, Alejandro and I focus more on the TV series, which is, I mean, it's really great to see how media representation actually works and actually takes the horror as a genre, and also the sub-genres that come with horror, and use them in a way to bring the Black person, the Black figure, into the center of representation, right? So that's what intrigued me with this TV show, and also considering the fact that most of the people and the writers and the producers are actually African Americans, that also adapts and gives them more of a fresh look and perspective on how people that were actually marginalized and excluded so long from representation, they are now in the center of attention, in the center of action, right? So I think this is really important to mention that as well, for TV shows and media representation in general.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I was intrigued because I haven't watched this series, but I've read Lovecraft, and I don't think Lovecraft is very Gothic. Well, I think you could argue he is, but you can also argue he isn't. It's more about horror, weird, how they call weird fiction, but I think, yeah, the series adds something new, because it approaches Lovecraft's horror as something much rooted more in the real world, and not in this completely set apart, isolated, fantastic world that's created and that's not based on a real one. So I think it's very, very interesting to confront the fiction by Lovecraft with this show. I need to watch it 100%, and yeah, I was familiar with words, novels as well, and yeah, of course, I agree with all of you. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you, Monica, for your question. I believe Hannah has another question for us.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's mostly for Elena and Alejandro, but of course, if Katerina wants to jump in and draw the question toward her own topic, I think the series is very interesting also in the way it constructs the historical period it refers to, and how actually the reality is represented and is reconstructed. Nonetheless, the protagonists they have this writer of travel guides role that is quite peculiar. So I think that's a very, very good device to introduce this idea that they are moving through the country, that they are going to a place of Gothic magic, to a place where something happens. And at the same time, throughout their travel, they keep on finding the same historical, real situations. They keep on living the same context in different parts of the country. So could you just, I don't know, say something about, do you think the historical reconstruction is done properly? Do you think this device also helps to that, or it's a little bit too stretched? I don't know. I was just thinking about that because I really like that specific element in the series, and I think that this, as we had our keynote for the ethnic session, talking about how this motion towards a place of horror is also very important in the Gothic. Is one of the peculiar characters of the Gothic. So how would you just say a few things or reflect on this element?
I can. I mean, oh, if Alejandro, do you want to go first? That, I mean, it's fine with me. No, okay. Since you mentioned, I mean, that was actually another aspect that made me like the show more, right? So I used to say like this moving from like, so to say, a safe place or a place that they know, right? So they move to unknown territories. That was really interesting. And I mean, to answer your question about how this is this actually depicts reality or not, the pilot episode is called Sundown. So this was they are going to a county that is they have like sundown rules that according to which like violence against Black people is allowed after the sun sets. So this is actually like historically accurate. So this happened during in Jim Crow America in the 1950s. So that is accurate. So some aspects of the show are of course are addressing this reality, and I think the show does a good job in that. And of course, we must keep in mind that this is also like as you said, constructing an alternative fictional world, right? So I think these both like the fictional aspect and the real aspect are really like are combined in a really great way in the show. And I mean, if you want to look back in the historical events that are represented there, like Alejandro mentioned, the Tulsa Race Massacre and Emmett Till's murder and many other like racist situations, degraded situations that the Black community had to face during that time. I think there is actually some level of realism and that is being depicted through these characters. I mean, that's how I interpret it. And I mean, focusing on the research I've done regarding how accurate some of the events are, there's a certain level of a certain percentage of realism in this TV show.
Yeah, and if I can add up something, well, as I said during my presentation, these fictional events and the fictional occurrences of the series bleed into reality. So the reality is all over the series. As I said, it's sometimes implicit, you can sense it, but it's not explicitly portrayed. But you know, these historical moments that you pointed out are there. They were real, and they are, I think, accurately portrayed. For example, in the last moments when they are in 1921 in Tulsa, you can see Monroe's, naming some of the victims of that massacre who were actually actual victims. So it's all there. And concerning the migration, these geographical movements, I think that they contribute to this sense of the uncanny, this mystery and this danger concerning some geographical points. For example, in episode 3, when the kids are playing Ouija and Emmett Till asks, will I have a good time during my trip to the south? And the Ouija goes suddenly to no, because we know Emmett Till during his trip to see his family in the south is murdered. Or for example, when they are discussing the content of the letter by Atticus' father, and I think it's Uncle George who asks, and where's that? And then Atticus says, it's in Lovecraft Country. And there's this air of fear, because they know that Lovecraft Country, that region, geographical region is, intrinsically racist and very traditional in those terms. I don't know if I answer your question, but that's what I think about this.
Yeah, definitely. And as Elena was talking about that scene in the Sundown County, I think that's very interesting because somehow for moments I felt it was subverting who are the monsters, the white people, these sort of Minutemen, as they're called now, were the prey for the first time in their life. But in that moment, they were a prey of these beings. So I think that is quite interesting. And absolutely, there are some good historical reconstructions in the series. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that. And I believe Katerina has a question.
Yes, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, but
Absolutely.
okay. I had a general question for both Alejandro and Elena, since I haven't seen the show, but I wanted to ask, like, what do you think are the limits of rewriting history? Because I'm thinking of like Hamilton, for example, or those types of projects where there's a clear racist, primary material that they're trying to subvert. How successfully can that be achieved?
Okay, well, can you ask that again, because I didn't. I want to make sure I understand your question. Your question.
Well, basically, because the show and the novel deal with Lovecraft's universe, basically, which has such racist overtones, basically. To what extent is a rewriting of that successful? Like, how much can you rewrite the primary material and subvert it, when necessarily you're still relying on the primary material and still giving, importance and shining a light on that material?
Okay, well, honestly, I don't know what's the possible stand to that, to that reconfiguring and rewriting. But in the case of this TV series, I think they do a magnificent job, because, they take on the influence, the Lovecraft's influence, for the, well, mostly for the first episode, because afterwards we don't see that much of that influence, except from the Shoggoths, for example. But, well, I think that it does it perfectly, because this conversation is a clear example. It raises some questions. It starts some conversations about, in this case, racism and Lovecraft and xenophobia, the black body, the Gothic in terms of how it portrays reality. So I think that this particular rewriting and reconfiguring of Lovecraft's literature and Lovecraft universe is very, very, to the point. Is great in those terms. So thank you for your question. And Paula, I don't know if I'm doing this correctly, but since I raised my hand, can I ask Katerina a question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about these problems with motherhood, because I found it striking when you talked about the girl who was pregnant and who was vomiting, and what she says about that she hasn't spelled everything because there's something in her. So it was striking and, very, very shocking. But how is it in terms of Gothic fiction? I mean, how Gothic is that sense of not wanting or rejecting what's inside your womb?
Well, I'd link it back to that idea of the uncanny, and also that disconnect between yourself and your own body, which I think was obvious in both your presentations, how the body is just something that you can completely disconnect from. And that, I think that's part of the Gothic essence, really. So with motherhood specifically, it's just such a striking thing because, you know, being pregnant, having a child, you're supposed to feel so connected to that life that you're creating. But the way like her life has been structured and the situation that she's been put in, it makes pregnancy and makes birth such dangerous states, and something that is basically just for survival and reproduction. It just mechanizes everything. So she's lost that connection to herself and the baby she's carrying. So that's why I made that connection with Beloved, because of that idea of the haunted house and her body being a bit of a haunted house in that situation. But in Beloved, the whole project is to expel the spirit, whereas in Salvage the Bones, the goal is basically to embrace it. And that's the subversion of expectations, especially from white society, that, you know, thinks of Black mothers, especially as welfare queens and just as kind of parasites to the system. And she's pushing against all that. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yes, it does, it does. But well, since you have mentioned that of the parasite, it, you know, this sense of rejection on the hunting of her body, is it because she felt that her offspring was a parasite to her or to the system as well?
Most obviously to herself, because she doesn't have any positive images of motherhood. Her mother died during childbirth. She's seen the dog and how being a mother is such an animalistic thing in her world. And she is a bit like Dewey Dell, if anybody has read As I Lay Dying, but a bit more self-aware about her situation. So I think she sees the child as a parasite to her body first and foremost, but then like by extension as a parasite to her family and her community, because they're a poor family. They're already 4 children, I think, and you know, to add another mouth to that, is she feels like she failed in that respect, whereas it's just the system that failed her ultimately. There's a scene where she does try to find any options about maybe terminating the pregnancy or any other option, and there just isn't. She's not given any choice.
Well, thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we have to close this session now. So now if I can ask the audience to turn on their cameras, if they feel comfortable doing so, of course. We will close this panel just thanking our speakers for their wonderful presentations. And well, just as a final thing to say, Katerina, Alejandro, Elena, thank you so much for your participation and your enthusiasm. I have truly enjoyed this session, and I really hope to see you very soon in other panels. So thank you so much.